Hello there, Mentioners. If you haven't subscribed to our premium podcast, Beyond Mentioning, here's what you missed this week. Hello there, Beyond Mentioning listeners. For the next several weeks, we will be listening to the audio version of The Mentionables Project, a book in which 5 of the Mentionables answered 40 atheist questions. The audio that you will hear features the voices of several of the original authors reading their answers to these questions. We hope you enjoy.
The Mentionables Project. 5 Christian apologists answer 40 atheist questions. Editor Joel Furches.
Introduction to the Mentionables. In July of 2017, an online conversation began between myself, Joel Furches, Tyler Vela of The Freed Thinker, Chad Gross of Truth Bomb Apologetics, Adam Coleman of True ID, and Nick Peters of Deeper Waters. The one thing we all had in common was that we were all Christian apologists with our own small ministries. Emphasis on small. The conversation went thusly. Wouldn't it be nice if unrecognized but talented Christian apologists received enough exposure so that the church was aware of these resources in its midst? In a world where atheists are more vocal and often more informed on the Bible than Christians, some of the most important resources that sit elbow to elbow with you at church go unnoticed. And if Christians began to take advantage of their local apologists, the gradual crumbling of the American church might slow and then stop. The church might actually experience growth if it knew that there were dedicated people who had answers to the questions hammering it down by the culture around it. Certainly there were big names, celebrity apologists who had the limelight, but was this really enough? These small voices in the crowd were worth mentioning, and the gospel is mentionable. This conversation amidst we small-time voices began as idle speculation and light-hearted joking. The conversation grew so lengthy that I decided to create a separate Facebook group just to keep the discussion going. But I made a mistake. I created a page instead of a group. The difference is that a Facebook group is just a place for like-minded people to post and discuss on topics on which they share interests. A Facebook page is a front for a business or organization. By sheer accident, I had given us a face for an organization. Thereafter, we actually began to talk more seriously about the Mentionables. By this time, Chad and Adam had dropped off the discussion. I wanted a team of 4, so I tagged in another small-time apologist I had interviewed in my years as a Christian journalist, Neil Hess of Soul Winning Ministries. He joined and began hosting a joint podcast under our name. Soon we had a YouTube channel with regular talks and videos being added, and all of the social media feeds with regular updates. we began to receive endorsements from some big-time apologists like J. Warner Wallace and Sean McDowell. We had our own website and hosted an occasional live stream show on Facebook and YouTube. Excited as I was by this gradual snowballing of events that seemed to have begun a grassroots movement amidst the smaller voices in apologetics, I mentioned the event to a friend of mine from college who now lived 2 states away from me in North Carolina. By the next day, he had arranged an apologetics conference for our group on his own initiative. Shortly after this, Chad and Adam came back on board for the team, and we now had 6 members. I felt this was plenty for a speaking team, but new people kept expressing interest in the group. The whole point of the movement had been to give voice to your friendly neighborhood apologist, and I didn't want to turn away talented amateurs, but I already had 6 members, and the team was beginning to look a bit bloated. What to do? This was when the idea of the network emerged. For new apologists who expressed an interest in joining the Mentionables, I began placing them in a national catalog of apologists. Now anyone could go into the catalog, locate an apologist close to them, and find out what this apologist does, the services they offer, and the topics on which they speak. Better still, small-time apologists from around the country could search the catalog, finding the services these mentionables offered, things such as audio and video editing, philosophical advice, and guest writing, and then take advantage of these services that they needed. With a conference and a podcast under our belts, I began to look for other projects, opportunities for our group to do. We began to seek out and record friendly debates with atheists for broadcast on our podcast. A few of us began to make appearances at local conferences, not as speakers, but with tables at which we sold books authored by the team and offered promotional material about the group. We began to receive questions from fans and listeners who had apologetics or theology problems and wanted answers. I would throw the question out to the entire network and then publish every answer I received on the group's blog. This way, readers had the advantage of getting several perspectives on the same question, rather than one man's opinion. This became our Question of the Week program. It was this model that carried over to the document you hold in your hand. In November of 2017, I came across an article on Hub Pages, a publication for which I also write. The article was titled 40 Questions to Ask a Christian. It was written by an atheist, and the 40 questions, which actually turned out to be only 39, were tactical tricks which attempted to disarm and silence the Christian to which they were posed. This gave me a brilliant idea. I made the suggestion to the network that we work on these questions together in a similar fashion that we did with our Question of the Week. We each give our own individual answer, and then put them together to give readers a well-rounded response. The questions in this document may be from one atheist, but they represent a number of common objections, especially familiar to self-titled infidels who work to frustrate Christians, frequently in online context. In this document, you will find answers from 2 of the founding members, Tyler and myself. You will also see answers from network members, Caleb Johnston and Mark Lambert. Some of these responses will be brief and pointed, the kind of answer that is easy to understand and appropriate in an online context, where only sound bites will work. You will also find slightly more extensive answers that give some easily understood insight into the challenge as it is posed. Finally, you will find more in-depth answers, often heavy on theology and scholarship. In short, you will find the kind of answer you are looking for, whatever your preference, and the answer will come to the problem from a variety of angles, without contradicting one another. Cultural challenges to your belief need not be feared, and, no matter what the challenge, there is probably an apologist close at hand, one that is worth the mention.
Contributors: Joel Furchess.
Joel Furchess is a freelance writer and author who has been writing for Christian publications for a decade, with a focus in the field of Christian apologetics. In his work for various Christian publications, Joel has interviewed influential people in ministry, has researched and written on church history, has directly engaged in atheist arguments and dialogue, has written on theology, and has even written articles giving tips on church and ministry management. Joel has a bachelor's in psychology and a master's in education, and taps into his background in psychology and philosophy to address these questions. Readers will also see a heavy focus on doctrine in Joel's answers.
Tyler Vela.
Tyler operates the ministry The Free Thinker Podcast, wherein he blogs and podcasts on subjects related to apologetics and philosophy, in which he has his degree. Tyler adheres to the Reformed tradition of theology, which will be evident in the answers he gives. Tyler's answers will be intentionally brief and will often be answers in the right direction, pointing toward where he thinks a full answer can be found.
Nick Peters.
Nick Peters has a background in apologetics, which focuses strongly on the argument for the resurrection. However, in his line of work, Nick has interacted with apologists on practically every subject under the sun, and therefore is well-versed in apologetics in general. Nick and his wife have Asperger's, which has become a guiding force in his ministry, both to minister to disabilities within the church and to focus on the importance of marriage. Nick's contribution will seek to connect to the reader by marrying both the intuitive with the analytical in his answers, often giving them a devotional quality.
Caleb Johnston.
Caleb Johnston has a Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology from Roanoke College. He lives in Roanoke, Virginia with his wife Raquel and their 4 children. Following a crisis of faith, he has spent 6+ years as an avid student of apologetics and looks forward to his eventual pursuit of a master's degree in this subject. He has spent the last 2 years hosting a multi-belief small group and has recently joined the Mentionables Network in Ratio Christi. In his spare time, he works on his own blog and ministry development at Subjected to Truth. Caleb answers these questions with a street-level approach. The goal of most of these questions is to either plant seeds of doubt for the Christian in the conversation or to end the conversation by presenting something unanswerable. His answers will attempt to provide brief and concise responses that help to contribute to the dialogue while still answering concerns. Caleb's goal as an apologist is to put a stone in someone's shoe, as Greg Kokel puts it. His job is not to win every argument, but to keep the conversation going and to break up barriers. Caleb would like to think of it as tilling a garden, breaking up and removing rocks so the soil can be reached. This is the goal of Caleb's approach to his answers. Till the ground, help prepare it for planting. It is Caleb's hope that his answers will provide some practical approach to addressing some of these questions.
Mark Lambert.
As a pastor, my approach is not usually to be quite so academic, but to answer questions in a way that people can understand and apply. As I was answering these questions, that was my intention. Some of them did indeed require a bit more unpacking, but it was my goal to keep my answers as short and to the point as I could with a more casual and conversational tone.
Introduction. 40 questions.
In his 2016 article, 40 Questions to Ask a Christian, atheist Thomas Swan, who describes himself as a doctor in the cognitive science of religion, suggests that in impromptu arguments between Christians and atheists, as opposed to structured debates, the best tactic an atheist can employ is to ask difficult questions, forcing the Christian to think through their position. Swan doesn't elaborate on the tactic except to say that, ultimately, thought is what an atheist should be trying to elicit. By asking the right questions, one can determine the direction that such thought takes. Of course, it's admirable to encourage anyone, Christian, politician, or salesman, to think through their worldview and positions in life. But based on the phrasing, it appears that Swan is more concerned with taking the reins of the conversation so that they, the atheist, are in charge of the direction the conversation takes. This honestly sounds a bit like the atheist version of the tactic taken by Christian presuppositionalists. This is a Christian apologetics tactic, which also relies on asking questions in order to direct the conversation. Under a presuppositional tactic, the Christian questions the standards and laws that the person assumes when making an argument, asking things such as, "What makes such and such wrong?" will theoretically cause the person to admit that there exist transcendent standards, such as logic, justice, reason, beauty, love, etc., that people operate off of when they think or speak. If transcendent standards exist, they must be based on some transcendent source. Instead of asking questions to backtrack along the person's line of reasoning, though, Swann's tactic seems more to be ask a hypothetical question that places the Christian in a circumstance where the worldview does not work. The Christian is forced to realize that Christianity, as a worldview, must necessarily fail under certain circumstances. The problem, or genius, depending on which side you're coming from, with hypothetical questions is that they stack the deck against the other person. The person to whom the question is directed is forced to assume the rules of the questioner in order to give an honest answer. For instance, Christians are sometimes found asking atheists, "If you die and find out God is real, what are you going to tell him?" It's a loaded question, because the atheist has to play by the rule of the question and is trapped in the corner of imagining she was wrong. She isn't allowed by the question to argue for the truth of atheism, just imagine its failure. This is a pretty common tactic in the questions posed by Swann. He asks the Christian to imagine they exist under different circumstances, and then gives some kind of honest answer to this entirely hypothetical situation. Consequently, the person addressing the question has three options. 1. Evade the question with answers that do not fully operate within the parameters of the hypothetical. 2. Admit that Swann is right. If they were placed in the scenario he describes, they would be forced to function by the rules he lays out. Or 3. Question the question. Perhaps more ingenious still is that Swann's questions almost always demand a yes-no answer. The genius of this tactic is that one can trap the answerer in a false dilemma, such that either answer is condemning to the questioner. Much like the classic example, "Have you stopped beating your wife?" Answer yes, and you are more or less admitting that you have beaten your wife in the past. Answer no, and you are admitting that you are currently beating your wife. If you are not a wife beater, the question does not offer you the option of explaining this. These tactics, hypothetical scenarios and false dilemmas, are worth looking out for in the questions in this series. In this document, members of the Mentionables will examine Swann's questions, both apologetically and tactically. Questions in this series may include answers from more than one mentionable, so as to give the reader a well-rounded catalog of responses from which to operate. The value of the series is that a number of the questions are actually being used regularly, typically in online exchanges, and sometimes even in formal debates. Almost always in atheist memes that circulate the web. Moreover, Swann's tactic is actually in play in a number of dialogues. Having these Q's and A's will provide the reader with a handy catalog of references when these questions arise. Read and absorb these answers, and it will make navigating exchanges about one's faith that much easier. Also, look at the tactic and strategies taken by these apologists who answer these questions. These may be valuable tactics when caught in these situations yourself. To atheist readers, it is worth seeing the Christian side of the equation, whether to consider the worldview in a fair and robust manner, or to avoid asking questions that already have solid answers. To begin, the reader will note that the questions have been broken up into categories labeled regarding X. These are Swann's categories, and he assigned them to the questions in his article, 40 Questions to Ask Christians.
Tyler Vela,
In this series, Swan is setting out to furnish atheists and agnostics with a list of questions that he believes will do a better job of dismantling Christian dogmatism than direct approaches will. This project is similar to other attempts at Socratic tactics like that of Peter Boghossian and his street epistemology. The problem here is that, like many modern unbelievers, Swan doesn't appear to have taken the time to understand the views which he's trying to dislodge from people. While I am glad that he admits parties on all sides of these discussions, ostensibly unbelievers included, can get bogged down by concerns of ego, he then goes on to poison the well by saying that Christians believe themselves to have wisdom that he clearly doesn't think they have. Here ignoring the difference between wisdom and knowledge, true belief, and that they have not thought about their beliefs until the noble atheist gives them the opportunity to do so. This project of eliciting thought has been one of the goals of my ministry from the beginning, and, to be frank, I've found the Brights to be rather obstinate against thinking outside of their own naturalistic worldview of considering the challenges posed by those who stand in opposition to it. So what Swan really is attacking is not historic Orthodox Christianity, which has been held to and defended by some of the greatest minds in history, but rather to a kind of intellectual bottom-of-the-barrel, fundamentalistic, hyper-literal, anti-intellectual, legalistic, evangelical, and I use that term in the most broadly cultural sense. To that end, most Christians who would be interested in having these discussions would themselves likely want those people to think more robustly about their views before they speak in public. It has nothing to do with the truth or falsity of Christianity, but in the anti-intellectual trappings of a very narrow sliver of Christendom present in the late modern Western secularized world. So as a Christian who takes my beliefs seriously, I can agree with Swan that marginal set of Christians should engage in reasonable reflection on their beliefs more, but I think that can lead them to even deeper understandings and trust in the historic Christian faith, not toward a problematic and reflexively destructive naturalistic worldview like that of the modern atheist and agnostic. So let us explore the questions that he poses. My answers will be intentionally brief and will often be answers in the right direction, pointing toward where I think a full answer can be found. Like what you heard? Sign up to get the premium podcast or visit thementionables.org to purchase your copy of The Mentionables Project.